I've always believed that childhood and the innocence that goes with it were things that were supposed to be protected and guarded. It appalls me that there are adult people out there who don't feel the same way, who are prepared to destroy both of those things to satisfy their own despicable needs and desires. This is the sad story of a young life cut short in the most brutal fashion, and the 30-year ordeal to bring the perpetrator to justice. It was the 7th of October 1992, a seemingly ordinary Wednesday evening which would turn into a nightmare for one particular family. 7-year-old Nikki Allan was visiting her grandfather, who lived in the same apartment block. They only lived one floor apart, and at the end of the visit, Nikki decided to walk home alone. She knew the route well and had done it countless times. At around about 8:30, Nikki's small steps echoed through the corridor of the building. Sadly, these would be some of the last moments of her life. And Nikki was born in the 1980s, one of 4 daughters to a lady called Sharon Henderson. The family lived in a housing estate in Sunderland in the northeast of the UK. The apartment block that they lived in was called Weir Garth. Sharon worked as hard as she could to provide for her daughters, but she was aided as much as he could by her father. Their grandfather, who I've already mentioned, lived in the same apartment block. And despite their struggles, Sharon attempted to make the home a place of warmth and joy. And Nikki was a lively and cheerful child, and she was especially close to her grandfather and used to visit him on a regular basis. As I've said, after the visit on this particular evening, Nikki set off alone. But when Sharon Henderson arrived home, Nikki was nowhere to be found. To begin with, this didn't alarm her because her other daughters had not arrived either. But when they eventually did arrive, they said that they hadn't seen Nikki, and this began to ring alarm bells in Sharon's head. After Sharon consulted her father, he confirmed that Nikki had set off before the other girls, and panic began to set in. Neighbours joined Sharon in a desperate search that went on through the night. In all, about 100 people joined the search. They didn't find anything that night, and at dawn on October the 8th, the police were called in. After a search of the area, Nikki's shoes and coat were found near the entrance to an abandoned building close by. This was the derelict quayside Old Exchange building. The police entered the building to search, and after a short while they found a dark stain on the floor which led to Nikki's lifeless body. It was obvious from the outset that she had suffered an absolutely brutal attack. She had multiple stab wounds and she'd suffered trauma to the head. The entire city of Sunderland was completely shocked. Hundreds of people attended Nikki's funeral, and media coverage put immense pressure on the authorities to find the perpetrator of this heinous crime. A murder investigation had begun, and pretty soon it zeroed in on a young man called George Heron, who lived close by. He became the prime suspect when a search of his home turned up a knife and blood-stained clothing. In addition to this, 4 witnesses placed him close to the scene of the crime. Police put him through hours and hours of intense interrogation, and eventually George Heron seemed to crack and admitted to murdering Nikki. In late 1993, George Heron stood trial at Leeds Crown Court for the murder of Nikki Allan. However, during the trial, the judge was absolutely astounded at some of the things that they heard. It was eventually ruled that George Heron's confession had been coerced and was therefore inadmissible, and the police came under intense criticism for the way they'd handled the investigation. The rest of the evidence against Heron was purely circumstantial, and at the end of the trial he was acquitted. Now, this left the police again searching for the perpetrator of the crime, although they still thought Heron was guilty, as did Sharon Henderson. After the trial, George Heron, who had said no less than 120 times during his interrogation that he did not kill Nikki Allan, had to move from the Sunderland area, because he was getting all manner of threats from people, including death threats. He changed his identity, but in spite of this, in 1994, Sharon Henderson brought a civil suit against him for wrongful death. Now, in a criminal trial, you have to be convicted beyond reasonable doubt. But with regards to a civil suit, that has to be proven balancing the probabilities. And in this case, Heron was found guilty and £7,000 was awarded to Sharon Henderson. However, she never saw a penny of this because George Heron was not found. After this, the case went cold until around about 2014. Now, at this time, a prisoner, someone who was already incarcerated, a serial killer called Stephen Grieverson, came under suspicion for Nikki Allan's murder, and he was arrested for such. He was questioned, but DNA evidence eventually ruled him out, and he was told that he would face no further action. All through this, Sharon worked tirelessly so that Nikki's case didn't go even colder. She kept it in the public eye by making petitions and giving news interviews. And then in 2017, there was a breakthrough. Advancements in DNA technology gave an insight into someone who might be responsible. The DNA evidence initially came from what was thought to be an unknown male. But DNA samples were taken from hundreds of men in the locality where Nikki Allan lived, and this eventually yielded a suspect in 2018. This suspect was 54-year-old David Thomas Boyd, a neighbour who lived close to Nikki's home. Significantly, Boyd had a previous history of offences against children. David Boyd was arrested to begin with, but eventually he was released because the evidence against him was not solid. But the suspicions of the police remained. And so in 2019, amid investigative delays and changes in the leadership of the police force, the case lingered on, still open. Later after this, new witness statements did come to light, and in 2022, the Crown Prosecution Service took over the case. In May 2022, David Boyd was rearrested, and after extensive questioning, he was finally charged with Nikki Allan's murder. In June 2022, David Boyd appeared by video link at Newcastle Crown Court and pleaded not guilty to her murder. His subsequent trial began in April 2023. As the trial progressed, compelling DNA evidence was put forward which linked David Boyd to Nikki Allan. Traces of his DNA had been found on her body. Now, David Boyd tried to get around this by saying that at one point during the evening he had been on the balcony of his flat and he'd spat out into the street. He said that his DNA was probably in that saliva and that Nikki Allan must have picked it up as she was passing by. But this was not believed. The prosecution alleged that David Boyd had lured Nikki Allan to some nearby waste ground where he had either sexually assaulted her or attempted to sexually assault her. And when she put up a struggle, he struck her in the head, causing her to bleed. It was alleged that Boyd then took her to the old derelict building where she was eventually found and forced her through a partially boarded up window into the darkened building. We're left to imagine what must have been going through the mind of that poor young girl as she was forced into the dark building, perhaps trying to run away from the person that was attacking her. It was then alleged that David Boyd had followed her into the building where he had beaten her around the head with a brick. We don't know whether this caused her to just go unconscious or whether it actually killed her. But what we do know is he then went on to stab Nikki Allan 37 times, probably with a knife. The evidence started to stack up against David Boyd. There was the DNA evidence which, despite his protestations about having spat out into the street, was found on 2 separate parts of Nikki's body. The jury were told that David Boyd knew the layout of the building. In fact, he'd been there a few days earlier with a young boy when he'd taken him there to search for pigeons. He'd also misled police about his whereabouts that evening. He'd said that he'd gone for fish and chips, but he said he'd gone there an hour before he actually had. And finally, David Boyd was said to strongly resemble a man that eyewitnesses had seen walking with a young girl they thought was Nikki Allan. The jury retired to consider the verdict, and on the 12th of May 2023 they returned to find David Boyd guilty of the murder of Nikki Allan. The judge took approximately 40 minutes to sum up the case, during which time the full extent of David Boyd's sadistic nature came to light. At the end of this, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a tariff of 29 years to be served before he was eligible for parole. Despite the fact that justice had been done, nothing would bring Nikki back. Police would eventually apologise for the mistakes that were made in the investigation. It had been a full 30 years since Nikki's murder. In August of 2023, it was reported that Sharon Henderson was considering suing Northumbria Police for the 30-year delay of justice. It was also reported that the case would be reviewed by the Independent Office for Police Conduct, or indeed another police force, to try and find out what could have been done better. In October 2024, David Boyd made an appeal against his conviction, but this was rejected. As it stands at present, he will not be able to apply for parole until 2049. It would be my hope, and I'm sure the hope of a lot of other people, that his parole at this time would be rejected because of the heinous nature of what he did to this poor young girl. And as a final note, George Heron, the man who was wrongly accused of Nikki's murder, continued to try and rebuild his life. He said that his life was destroyed by the false accusation. Having to change his identity and run from death threats, some of his relations had since died, and he wasn't even able, because of the threats, to attend their funerals. He did, however, applaud the later investigators for finally solving the case. And on that note, I'll ask you to stay curious and stay safe, and I'll thank you for watching.